couple good food that didn't go over.
Do you mind if I record you?
We're actually going to be putting it out on Twitch, so go right ahead.
This is in regards to my daughter, who is a author in the area of foods. Particularly, she's an expert in historical preparations and foods. She asked me to get free samples too. That's what I was asking.
I don't have free samples. Don't have, well, you know.
Well, actually, I think she said handouts, and I said any handouts I get, I'll eat.
Paper. You can have my notes that I scribbled on afterwards. What time is it?
It's about
7:50.
3 minutes due. We've got 3 minutes. See if other people show up. I tend to pace a lot. This is a habit I picked up when I was teaching grad school, intro to computer science. I had
Never give them a standing target.
Well, I had an 8 o'clock in the morning class, 5 days a week for summer.
Kept you awake while you were teaching?
And it was to keep the students awake, because actually every morning I would wake up in my office at 10 a.m. with my feet up on the desk, having taught the class. I learned to keep moving. That keeps the students awake, and also throwing chalk helps. So the student gets smart. Hang up a piece of chalk. I know you've got background in the whole medieval food thing.
Who, me?
Just a little.
Ginny told me I couldn't handle you.
You can ask questions, though.
I will ask questions.
I will. I tend to leave time for questions, or I'll try to leave time for questions. One of the things, I tend to automatically put myself off on tangents. So if something, if I seem to have lost the point that I was heading towards, feel free to push me back on track. Of course, it might be a little hard to know that I am off my tangent.
Is it a monorail?
Trains left the station.
Train's left the station? The train hasn't gotten into the station in ages. How much time we got still?
About another minute or so.
Okay. I had a friend of mine in grad school was teaching mathematics. And he had trouble getting his class to respond to him at all. He's lecturing to a class of just. So I told him, well, always get a response. If you ask a question and they don't answer, ask a different question. They don't answer, keep, and until you get to the point of like, does anybody want a quarter? And if somebody raises their hand, you give them a quarter. Then you go on. You got to get them, train them to respond. It actually worked. Although he went through quite a bit of change.
What happened when they found out that only one guy was going to get the quarter though?
Well, then there's competition. They got to respond faster. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Myers. I am a database programmer and novice author, but I've been running the Medieval Cookery website for over 20 years. I'm into food, and I got into food kind of in a strange way, into medieval food. I joined the SCA when I was an undergrad, the Society for Creative Anachronism, and I discovered that when you put on a helmet and somebody hits it with a sword, it's really noisy. Didn't like that at all. And I also discovered that the girls in the kitchen, because they were predominantly women, tended not to hit quite as hard. So I like to hang out with them.
Obviously, you've never met my sister.
I said tended. There are exceptions. And I could duck a spoon pretty well. I'm going to take a slightly odd approach to this. If you've seen my previous talks at Gen Con or Origins, I'll usually start with a round of medieval food myths. but I want to try a little different tact. The Victorians have a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is the Victorian mindset. At the time, they felt that they were the pinnacle of human achievement. And because of that, when they started to look at what had gone before, because England had all these cookbooks just tucked away, handwritten cooking manuscripts in the British Library and places. And when the Victorian scholars would look at these, they were looking at it through a Victorian lens that said, we are up here. And of course, if we are up here now, that means 200, 300, 400 years ago, they must have been at a lower level. Must have been. So you ended up with things like Samuel Pegg reading the one of the form of curry, 14th century cookbook early, and noticing that the recipes had lots of spices in them. Oh, lots and lots of spices. So, well, of course, obviously they're using all those spices to cover up the taste of the spoiled meat. I got a problem with that. I got a couple problems with that. First of all, hearing an Englishman talk about how food is too spicy is really hysterical. Yeah, that's no. And he wasn't saying, and everybody else then quoted him, saying, "Oh, well, yeah, they put lots of spice on their food to cover it." No, he was saying, if you look at what was actually he was looking at, there were a large number of different spices in the meat dishes, not a large quantity of spices in the meat dishes. And a large number of spices to an Englishman in Victorian ages is like
Salt?
one. That's, you know, anything over salt is and you got to question, be careful about the amount of salt you put in too, because you know it might inflame the passions and make people like those people on the continent. But then there's the whole idea of the spoiled meat. And if you look at the documents that they were looking at, medieval people were eating a lot of meat. Why were they slaughtering animals, letting them sit around till they got rotten, and then eating them? No, because they weren't. Nobody would do that. And then you also have the question, yeah, because your cows don't rot while they're on the hoof, right? Generally, you know, you talk to some vet techs, yes, sometimes things happen, but you don't eat that cow because, you know, it's not happy. But you also have the problem of spices were relatively expensive, not hideously so, about 10 times the cost of what they are now for the average daily wage. Are you really going to use $50 worth of spice on a $2 chicken? That doesn't make sense either. You know, heck, throw it out, get a fresh chicken. So you end up seeing a lot of Victorian beliefs being sort of overlaid or stamped, and the whole reason being they have to be superior to this, so it must have been horrible then. Of course, what do we know about the conditions of the working poor in Victorian England?
A lot.
Yeah, not pretty. So obviously the Middle Ages must have been worse. So let's take a look at some of the aspects of medieval food in general. And I'm talking about 1100 AD to 1500 AD. And primarily England, Germany, Spain, kind of, France. Not Poland, kind of, sort of. The farther you get away from England and France, the weirder things get. There's an odd aspect to this, actually. How hard is it to cook things? I started thinking about if you had Gordon Ramsay here,
Shoot him.
and a couple of his well-trained assistants, you know, or pick your actual chef of preference. If you gave him some knives, some cutting boards, a heat source like an oven or a stove, and you could even limit it. You could like break the knob on the stove so you can't tell how hot it is, right? Take away all the clocks out of his kitchen, and then give him all the fresh fruits and vegetables and fresh meats and all the spices he wants. He's going to produce a really damn good meal, right? I have no question about it. So why do people automatically assume, if you look at some of the horrendous, especially 20-year-old Hollywood films about medieval food, that all they had was roast meat and maybe a bowl of mashed potatoes, turkey drumstick, they're assuming that the food is really primitive, all brown bread and for nobility. And have you watched some of those films? You know what I'm talking about. And yet, if we drop Gordon Ramsay in there, he can make anything. And these are kings who can afford the best cooks they can find. So they're hiring the Gordon Ramsay of their time. Which means the food probably was a lot better than we're imagining. Or at least a lot better than Hollywood's imagining. For example, bread. I mentioned bread, didn't I? If I didn't, for example, bread. What color was medieval bread? Be quiet.
Red
Red color? Good answer.
Depends on your level of,
Yeah, it depends on your status. But what's required to make bread white as opposed to brown?
Filtering the flour.
Not even bleach. Bolting. You just take a fine mesh and you put the ground wheat on and you shake it through and all the good white stuff falls out and you got a bunch of brain in the bag, right? They did that. They actually had the word bolting for bolting flour comes from passing it through a bolt of linen. So they could have white bread, and I'm not talking home style whole wheat white. No, I'm talking Wonder Bread white bread. And yet but now that was for the wealthy, yeah, because it takes effort. It takes people to bolt the flour and get out all the brown bran and stuff. But it's still not out of the question. I mean, it depends on what level of income you've got. But if you're really, if you're a fairly well-to-do middle-class person, you can go ahead and get a little white bread down there, right? And yet you'll still see in some of the older versions of Robin Hood them tearing into these dark brown loaves. It's like, oh, that's peasant food. Don't eat that. Don't give that to the king. Then you get there are some wonderful things I've seen in Hollywood films that I just love looking at. The classic, the feasts are all meat. And like, no. If you look at the 15th and 14th century menus, there were like heaps of vegetables being added in, and they liked meat because humans like meat. You also get the idea that the poor people didn't eat meat, right? You've heard that. Anybody ever raise chickens? How much effort does it take to raise a chicken? No,
yeah, you gotta clean the pigeons, you gotta clean the cages out.
there's some cleaning stuff, but for the most part,
No, it's not much.
they get the bugs themselves and they eat. And how much trouble is it to raise a pig?
Probably a lot more. Well,
You have to find them sometimes if you don't pen them up well.
Yeah.
But it still is not a lot. So if you had land, and yes, you're farming most of it, but you could build a nice little pen there and keep chickens, which grow to slaughter age really fast.
You got eggs.
And you got eggs. So why wouldn't the poor people be eating meat?
Depends where they are.
That's where we are. But surprisingly, even the poor people in downtown London or downtown Paris were eating meat. They were bringing in cows and pigs and chickens live into town and slaughtering them there. And oh, that whole rotten meat thing, that's the other part of it. There were penalties for butchers who slaughtered meat or slaughtered an animal. They were not allowed, if they slaughtered it in the morning, they were not allowed to sell it the next day. And there were really serious penalties if they did. And if they slaughtered it in the evening, they could sell it the next morning, but not in the next afternoon. And then, yeah, there's all sorts of documentation about this. So, the poor people were eating meat to a certain degree, and it was reasonably fresh. Oh, and the other one I love, there were laws against the people who slaughtered meat and the people who made pies being the same person. They didn't want anybody sort of keeping some of that older meat slipping into the pies. So yeah, butchers were not allowed to make pies, and pie makers were not allowed to kill animals. The other oddity, and this is an odd little sidetrack, that drives me nuts watching movies. Okay, when I watch a movie, if there's food in it, my mind is just riveted right there. It's like ooh. And there was anybody see The Girl with a Pearl Earring? There's a couple scenes in that film. My wife and I were watching it, watching the screen, and we were both quiet. And I stopped and said, "You're looking at the textiles, aren't you?" And she said, "Yeah." "You're looking at that pie." "Yeah." All of this is in the background. There's these people are going on talking things, and I'm like, move out of the way. I can't see the turkey pie thing. What is that?
Yeah, I do the same thing with the old cars.
Exactly. And but then one of the funny things, and it happened in Star Wars, in one of the Star Wars films. I'm watching the food, and you'll get this thing where all of a sudden all the royalty are fruitarians. It's because the set dressers didn't know what to put on the plates. So you'll see the scene, they're talking, and everybody's plate has like an apple or a pear or a peach or plums or whatever, some grapes, all fruit. Because they could put it on the plates, have it there, and then put it back in the bowl and use it for the next scene. And it happened in the scene where Anakin Skywalker was grown up, going after Padme, and they had gone off to their little secret hideout place. I can't remember what the planet was, and they're eating, and the only thing on their plates is fruit. Now somebody's gone and taken one of the plums and done this spiral peel thing on it to make it look spacey, but it's just a freaking plum. There was nothing else there. But the other thing that drives me nuts, apparently in medieval Europe, in the movies, grapes are in season all year round. There's the Tudors episode where it's Christmas, and there's this big bowl of grapes. I'm like, yeah, where'd you get those?
I'm blanking on what the movie was specifically. It was like a 1960s, 70s medieval movie. And the comment was they were trying to do it as historically accurate as possible. And the comment from one of the, it was like a cast member's daughter or something, was, yes, they had to reshoot these scenes entirely because they shot them, and then someone pointed out, wait, they didn't have potatoes over in England back then. So the set dressers had to come in and replace every single potato with an apple. And then
Fix that. No, bad. One good consultant could have fixed everything and saved them so much money. But they never call.
The Simpsons had 3 pieces of unknown meat, mashed potatoes, and green beans at all of their meals. Every one of them was the same meal.
So let's talk about actually what foods they did have. I mentioned that they'd have meats, and in rural areas, actually they have a much wider variety of meats than we eat now. Because they're going to get venison, they're going to get rabbits, and they can eat any kind of bird they could get their hands on. Pigeons are great. A lot of pidgeys. But in urban areas, they tended to stick more to the standard livestock because it's easier to move. It's easier to get chickens to market, or pigs to market, or even cattle. And they'd bring them live on the hoof into the town. One of the fascinating things is they were always worried about leprosy. I don't think they quite had a good idea of what leprosy was, but anything that looked kind of off in an animal was attributed to leprosy. And the pigs, they checked the pig's tongue, and if they noticed any deformities on the pig's tongue, they'd clip its ear. This is a live pig, and that was the mark that no, they couldn't slaughter that pig. Because they'd get in trouble. And you don't want to know the kind of penalties. There was a penalty for a guy shorting a loaf of bread that was fairly well recorded, and he was basically driven in manacles around town with a loaf of bread hanging around his neck, so everybody knew what his crime was and throw things at him, spit on, mean stuff. The vegetables, kind of an interesting thing. Well, there's a lot of things that aren't appropriate for, in terms of meat, the real easy one, turkey, right? No turkeys in the old world. Now they were lazy. They had something they called a turkey, which was a guinea hen. So you see in 14th century cookbooks and such references to turkey fowl, because they said it was coming from Turkey. And in 16th century cookbooks, there's talk about turkey, and they're talking about two different critters. This makes historians really twitchy.
Well, it's corn and corn.
Yeah, and every grain was corn. Now, except maize, which we grow as corn here because they didn't have it before 15th century, or before 16th century. The funny thing about turkey that we know, the French term dindi means from India. So they didn't get theirs turkey, they got theirs from India. None of it came from there, but that's what anything foreign was claimed to come from Turkey. That was made it more exotic, more desirable on the market.
And they were eating guineas?
They were eating guinea fowl,
Yeah.
if they could get it.
I've had it, it's purple.
Really? I haven't been able to get any of that. But they had a lot of cabbage. Cabbage is a good food. Carrots, onions. Onions show up in a lot of medieval recipes. No potatoes. No capsicum peppers.
Turnips.
Turnips are good. No pumpkins. Now here's another one.
That's not from America.
They had something called a pumpkin. It's a gourd. The worst part is, it looks like a pumpkin. The medieval pumpkin is this round orange gourd that looks like a pumpkin. And oh man, is that confusing. Because they make things out of the gourd, but then we've got their New World pumpkins, they use that because it tastes better. But they didn't change the name. There are traps in that.
Does that medieval thing still exist? Does it still get one?
I think it does, but I don't think it's cultivated much because it's not very good. You said green beans. Actually, green beans are New World, along with navy beans and pinto beans and kidney beans, all those. Kidneys. The beans they had fava beans, various broad beans, and black-eyed peas, cowpeas. And there's another kind of
Lentils?
yeah, lentils, pulses and lentils. There was another kind of pea, like a pigeon pea, I think, that they had.
Chickpea?
And they had chickpeas. So, yeah, no chocolate, no vanilla, no coffee,
No, they had coffee.
not,
Coffee is New World.
but for most of
Old
the,
World, yes.
but for most of the
Old
Middle
World.
Ages, it hadn't come out of the Mideast far enough. So they didn't have it in France and Germany or Italy until much later. Which is a pity. Yeah, how miserable. No coffee, no chocolate,
They should have got so much more done.
no chili peppers. I had a friend from India, a coworker, who was telling telling me that, oh no, chili peppers originated in India. No, you're disagreeing with every botanist in existence. Then the whole quest for chili peppers. Now this is something I find really interesting. People like spicy food. They like something to, not everybody, yeah, but in general. So what were they using for spiciness before the chili pepper? And it turns out black pepper, cinnamon, ginger,
Cardamom?
not so much garlic, but for they wanted that bite.
Onion,
And onion. They also had grains of paradise, which is a really nice
horseradish.
horseradish. There's a cubebs, which are tailed pepper, and the long pepper. Long peppers are really funky. It looks like a really stretched out little hard pine cone in some ways. And it man, has that got a serious bite to it. But when they got capsicum peppers in the early 16th century, wow, man, did that catch on fast. Within like 50 years, capsicum peppers had worked their way into a prominent role in every cuisine in the world. Because, man, that's great. Gets the endorphins going. And one of the other aspects that's kind of important is that the food was seasonal, very highly seasonal, right? Like I said, you're not going to get grapes, no matter what the tutor says. You're not getting grapes in the middle of Christmas time. Grapes are going to only be in this one narrow fresh grape time, right? And what do you do with grapes the rest of the year?
Bottle.
make wine.
Yeah,
Raisins.
you bottle them, make wine, or you make raisins. And there's no differentiation in French between a raisin and grape. They're raisins. Interesting. And in a lot of medieval English recipes, they will refer to grapes as raisins, or raisins of grapes, or yeah, it's kind of they get a little bit confused in there. And raisins show up. Fresh grapes don't show up much in recipe books, but raisins show up a lot. You don't find many dried cherry recipes in England, but you find them in Italy. It's because it's really hard to dry anything in England. And that surprised me, because I had somebody say, what do you do with dried cherries? And I'm like, I don't know. And I found out that one of my associates had so, oh yeah, there's plenty of medieval dried cherry recipes. So she studies Italian cooking. I'm like, English, no. So yeah, you've got your foods and you preserve them as fast as you can, or you eat them. Actually, with cherries in England, instead of drying them, they would soak them in wine and sugar syrup, and anything that grew fuzzy on the top, they'd skim that off and throw it away. And it's safe to eat for the most part. But what happens in late winter, sometime into the spring, you start running out of food in England, especially England, France, and they call those the lean times. And what I find fascinating is that just happens to correspond with Lent. Coincidence? No, someone at the church said, you know, if we make the royalty not eat the good stuff during Lent, they're less likely to get overthrown. Because yeah, if you're sitting there eating like salt pork and salted fish and not much else, and you see the royalty over there in the manor, and they're chowing away on what beef that they've managed to keep happy, and so, no, that's not going to go over well. So yeah, medieval Lent was actually much more brutal than the modern Catholic Lent. For the entire period of Lent, there was no terrestrial animals, no eggs, no butter.
There were some interesting definitions of fish at times.
There were beaver tails were fish
Otters
because they
were
looked like
fish. Puffins were fish.
I'm not sure about the puffins. I know that the barnacle geese thing.
Mhm.
Somebody had decided that barnacle geese actually grew on trees and that they,
Yeah, a lot of it, if you look at the medieval bestiaries, you'll see a lot of it is basically, they didn't know where these animals came from because,
or sometimes I think they knew, but
well,
they were trying to get,
yeah, some people knew, but
the
they say-
Catholic Church with the Barnacle geese said, cut it out.
yeah.
There's a wonderful, a manuscript, and I can't remember how long back it was, that was scribbled in the margin of this book by some young school child, probably a boy, saying, "Oh, I wish Lent were over, for I am so weary of fish." But then the curious thing happens at the end of Lent, in my mind here, that what you've got is, during the lean times, you've slaughtered all the cattle you're going to slaughter. You need the ones for the spring, right? Your eggs, your chickens have stopped laying. Your cows have stopped giving milk because the calves grew up.
But you make cheese.
You've got some cheese, but towards the Lent period, you've pretty much run out of the cheese too, and you're not making any fresh. But then what happens in spring, around Easter time, the birds start laying again. And the sheep start giving birth to lambs, because it's springtime. Like, okay, lamb dinner for Easter, and Easter eggs, and you got sheep milk, but what happens if you can't afford those nice young lambs? Because there's going to be a limited supply that you're going to want to slaughter, right? Well, then you'd use the ham that you've had left over from the start of Lent that nobody was eating. So the ham and the lamb and eggs are all things, the natural result of getting through the lean times of Lent, and then that's what's there. That's what you got left. How are we set on time?
It's 8:30.
Go a few minutes more, and then I'm going to turn it over for questions. Another odd quirk, the diet that they were tending to eat. Like I said, the royalty were eating vegetables. The poor people were eating meats. But the foods that were really desirable, they liked meat, they liked the cheese, they liked sugar when they could get it. Early it was honey in like the 11th century, 12th century. But as soon as they could get sugar from Cyprus and they were bringing it in, they started putting sugar in everything, including the meat dishes. A lot of meats and sweet, syrupy. The dishes actually with the spicing tended to resemble Mediterranean, because they had lots of cumin and coriander and saffron. And but yeah, they had also the sweet sugars and stuff. Lots of sweets, lots of meats and fats, and you know, they then started, the royalty especially would end up with health issues of diabetes, gout, and obesity. I'm like, so that, you know, that much has not changed. They were having the same kind of problems. But the curious thing is, you know, people always have. I talked about how the poor people were eating meat, the rich were eating vegetables. Well, they can track to some degree how much each group was eating through isotope studies. They look at the isotopes of iodine and nitrogen and carbon in the remains in the bones, and they can see how much meat this person was eating, how much protein. They can determine how much was seafood and how much was grain, effectively. And for the most part, that's pretty much the same for the poor and the wealthy. And I had somebody ask me, and it kind of stumped me for a bit. I had to think, whoa. Well, if they were eating the same thing, why were the rich people getting diabetes and gout and all that, but not the poor people?
Exercise.
You ever hear about the Mediterranean diet?
Oh, yeah.
It's not as big anymore as it used to be, but they talked about how, oh yeah, the Mediterraneans, they're eating all this olive oil and butter and fat and not, and drinking wine and not gaining weight and being really healthy heart-wise, right? Then they looked into that study afterwards a little bit and realized that the study group that they'd been doing all the blood work with and everything, they were Mediterranean dock workers. It didn't matter what they were eating, they were burning every bit of it off, and they needed that fat intake just to survive. And that's kind of how it was with the medieval peasants. I mean, yeah, they were eating a lot of meat, they were eating, and by a lot of meat, I mean a lot of meat. There's the field workers in the Middle Ages were frequent, there's lists of what you give to your workers before you send them out to the field, and it included a gallon of ale and a pound of bacon. And that's their breakfast as you send them out. Gallon of ale for breakfast, yeah. So yeah, they were eating just as much of the horrible stuff in terms of fats, but they were burning everything off. Whereas, you know, Henry VIII, when he was having his good time in Hampton Court, he wasn't doing as much exercise. Any questions? Any ideas, thoughts, concerns?
They had a lot of grains to eat.
They did, and the grains that they ate, they tended to not be really good about separating them. So they plant mostly wheat, but sometimes rye, millet, other plants would grow in there.
Yeah, but they had their meal and stuff, but they made their flour and stuff.
But they would mill the grains frequently together, and you get what they refer to as for making maslin bread, which is a very dense mixed bread. That was for the workers, the guys you were going to send out to the field with their pound of bacon and their gallon of but if they were careful, they could separate out wheat. And one of the sources actually to make sure that they had just the pure white wheat for the nobility, because that sells better. One of the interesting sources I found for this, it was a book called Smoke and Thatch, and it documents the layer of thatch that they found on medieval buildings, and they would go in and identify what the different materials, the straws were for making the thatch, and they found there was a lot of mixed grains in there. And these things, the thatch, you know, they always picture in the show because it's like this little layer of, no, we're talking sometimes 3-foot layers of thatch, and the critters that lived in there, all sorts of, its own little ecosystem.
Did breadfruit ever enter into this?
I don't believe so. I don't recall seeing any references to breadfruit in any of the medieval cooking manuscripts I've seen.
Breadfruit was brought from the Pacific
I think, yeah.
in the 18th century.
And there we go. So,
Well, Union the Bounty was over breadfruit trees.
Right, they were.
but that was still
they
quite a
were
bit
in the
later.
Pacific.
Much later.
They were trying to bring them from the source to feed the workers, slaves in the Caribbean.
Breadfruit's interesting stuff. Yeah, none of the medieval breadfruit. There was some record of a medieval banana found in they found a banana peel, they thought, in a medieval midden from London. That's been called into question. One, that they're not sure it was actually banana peel, and the other problem is the middens in London tended to get churned up a lot, so you really couldn't be sure of what layer.
Which layer?
Yeah, which is a pity, because, you know, medieval banana split sounds pretty good. Other questions?
Well, didn't they have a lot of smokehouses?
They
That saved their, and they had to dry their meats.
They did
on
dry
that.
meats. Food preservation is a really interesting point, actually. Have you ever seen those sources that say salt was incredibly expensive, and they'll talk about, you know, they pay people their wages in salt?
Oh, yeah.
I heard of that.
Money.
It was important, but it wasn't expensive. Salt was dirt cheap. Literally, because in Germany they were pulling it out of the ground.
I've been to those mines.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of the mines and stuff, and they actually get bored. They carve cathedrals and stuff into the underground salt layers. There's a salt mine under Detroit.
The salt, the Great
Yeah.
Lakes have,
Cleveland.
the Great Lakes have a huge salt deposit under them.
But I mean, downtown Detroit.
Yeah.
Take an elevator down, and there's like,
There used to be, in ancient times, a sea that turned into a salt lake that dried up and left.
yeah, it just freaks me out, like, there's still these downtown, you think outside the city, maybe, not downtown Detroit.
Well, wasn't downtown back then.
That's true. Anyway, so yeah, the smoking meats, what they frequently do is actually hang the meats inside the chimney of their houses, of the manors. I assume they would build smokehouses for out farther away, but if you had a chimney, that was the best place to do it for small amounts of smoking. I found one recipe for smoked sausage that specifically said to use pine while smoking it. They wanted the resin from the pine, and I cannot imagine. That has to be like tasting Lysol sausage.
Maybe they take
Get used to it.
They
take the skin off of that sausage before they eat it.
I don't know. But that's a doozy though. Yeah.
So
I was told a story about wine in Greece after World War II. All the fighting, all the rough stuff, no one had any wood to make the barrels to make wine. And so in desperation, they used pine. And that produced a very exotic tasting wine, which they said, hey, maybe this isn't so bad. And so they produce it today. I used to know the name of it.
Retsina.
Somebody bought it for me, and I said, this is really bad.
You gotta be desperate to drink that, yeah.
But now they accept it.
Yeah.
When it comes to beverages, I mean, coffee is no very modern thing, and tea would have come from China. Did they have any hot beverages at that time, or was it like wine or whatever?
So here's-
They would mull wine. They would heat up wine, and I'm not sure they did the ciders, but they did mead as well.
I know a water issue is often can be where the water comes from and health issues.
For the most part, the water was fairly clean,
Oh,
and you find there was something like 100,000 medieval era water wells that they've still found in England. So yeah, they could get clean water. It's popularly believed that water wasn't safe to drink. In places, water wasn't safe to drink.
and probably like London where you have a dense
Yeah.
population, that's where
The
You
larger
didn't want to drink
cities in the
anything from near the
industry.
Thames, because bad.
Catnip.
What's where you're,
They made a tea out of catnip.
I can believe that.
yeah,
So-
catnip tea's a sleeper.
In a lot of old like medieval movies, they say like venison and boar and stuff like that was royalty food. Is that true or?
Depends on where you are.
And when you are.
And when. Yeah, there are some areas where, yeah, the king had a specific forest that was, federal. But there are other places, plenty of places in England where, no, they were getting their own food. And you find plenty of records, especially in the there's a book out there, the Household Accounts of Robert Earl Dudley, which is, I think, from the 14th century in England. And I paged through it. It's rather bizarre. They buy a lot of ribbons for his lordship. I'm not sure what the ribbons for his lordship are all about. And keys and urinals. Yeah, but you'll see lots of records of 2p to so and so, 2p to a boy for bringing his lordship a rabbit. And basically, what's happening is they're hunting, they're trapping, and then they bring in some of the deer or rabbit to the manor, and his lordship's cook will cook it, and they'll get some money and change. Yeah, they do that for bringing up wood. Like I said, urinals. I'm not sure what the heck was all about the urinals, but there was Robert Earl Dudley used up a lot of urinals. Last thing. Oh, if you ever see somebody selling it, if like Renfrews or such, these cute little shot glasses that are kind of round bottom, you can't set them down, and have a little fluted top, that's not a shot glass. They might be selling it as a shot glass, it's not a shot glass. That's so the doctor can get the urine and look at the color and smell it and taste and say, oh, you're sick. You got diabetes, don't eat.
It tastes like syrup.
Yeah, pretty much. How are we on? What's the time now?
8:42.
Oh, plenty of time. Plenty of time.
What sort of cooking equipment, like fireplace, or how do they?
Well, what they had, I mean, obviously they had good stove or cooktops essentially, because they put a fire and they put a grate over it. Ovens were a little more tricky because they'd have to build layers of
Bricks.
brick and mud or plaster but they could make ovens. They tended to make bigger ones and sometimes communal ovens for the town. So if you wanted to bake your bread, you'd make your dough, you'd take it to the baker would bake it and give you your bread back. If you were lucky. There's one account of the baker having installed a trap door in his counter so that the people would bring their dough to be made into bread, and the baker's assistant was under there, open a little door, take out some of the door. And then they'd put all that dough together and bake that and sell the bread for profit.
In A Christmas Carol, they send their turkey to the baker.
And yeah, exactly, because they don't have an oven, especially in London. They didn't have kitchens in their houses, in their apartments. They didn't have any cooking facilities. They get fast food.
Now, an indication of how recently they changed from where you really had to wash the oven is, there's a program that I saw on one of these old TV show stations, and it was a cooking show by this woman from England. And basically it was an advertisement for one of the first gas stoves that were out there that had the saying, now you're cooking with gas. That was her symbol. I forgot the name of the company. But she was talking about when she was younger, she was relatively old, having to watch the oven all the time to make sure the temperature was right. So it's a fairly recent shift to really good ovens where you could set the dial and this is the temperature.
Yeah, they didn't have good grasp of temperature or time, and that's one of the really interesting aspects of it. You'd see descriptions in the cookbook say, cook over a bright, sprightly fire. Or cook over a low, warm fire. And they're basically, if they were doing ovens, it'd be like Grandma used to do, stick your hand in the oven and see how hot it is.
Heat until blood warm or skin temperature or something like that.
But no, the best parts though were the times, the cooking times, because they didn't have clocks. So if you needed to cook something in a very short amount of time, and I've seen this in one recipe, boil for 9 Our Fathers.
It works.
It works.
And it turns out the Our Father in Latin said at breakneck speed comes out to about 30 seconds. So, 9. But if you wanted something longer than that,
Didn't they have candles that were?
no, even better.
Rosaries.
Cook for the length of the time it takes to walk a mile. How do you know how long that is? Boy, go to the Hobson farm, get some eggs, and come right back. The Hobson farm's half a mile away. When the boy comes back, it's done.
I've got the official White House cookbook from President Polk. And he tells you, bake in a moderate oven until done, that kind of thing.
So they didn't. Yeah, the time. They also didn't have a good idea of set quantities. And I think I mentioned to somebody here that one of the recipes that drove me absolutely nuts that I was working out was a recipe for a cherry pie, and it said take a good amount of cherries and some soft cheese, and it went on the with all these ingredients, and 3 eggs. Now I'm not sure good amount of cherries were good amount of cherries, but 3 eggs, we got that number.
I've seen that in colonial era cookbooks as well.
It took me something like 7 tries to get that recipe right.
Take a large handful.
Whose hand?
Yeah, not even a handful, a good amount.
How many cherries can you eat
They
in one
knew
sitting?
what it was.
They knew it.
That's a good
And thinking about all this, I remember something from my trusty home ec teacher back in the day, talking about why they invented cookies. And basically you were gonna bake a cake, and so you got all your cake batter, and you put some of it on a sheet to put it in the oven to see if it baked properly, and if it did, then you could put your whole cake in to bake it. And she said that after a while I came to the idea, you could just make a whole sheet of these little things, because there was always a kid around to eat that one cookie, your test cookie.
I'm not sure.
And I'm not sure how true that is, but according to her, that was it. So, and who am I to trust but my
It's a good
junior
story.
high home
I
ec
like
teacher?
that story, but it reminds me of the stuffing a chicken with unpopped popcorn. The story goes that you put in the seasoning into unpopped popcorn, and when the chicken blows the door off the oven.
So we're beginning of urban legends.
Yeah, so that does sound like a good story, but I'm very suspicious because they didn't have medieval cookies, but they did have things called fine cakes, which were sort of cookie-like, sort of halfway between cookie and cracker, and tended often to be a little more savory than sweet. And that was before they had invented cakes.
Well, that was her story, she was sticking to it, so.
I'm not criticizing you.
One of the things they used to get a steady heat was charcoal.
Yes.
Because charcoal is almost like having a fuel that you can meter. You put in a handful of charcoal, every 15-20 minutes, the coals come up fast, particularly if it's the porous charcoal, hold that temperature. I watched a cook down in Williamsburg who represented the French chef that the English governor brought in because he just couldn't have anybody cooking for him because he was the governor. Mm-hmm. And he's showing all this whole thing about a grill in the back, dropping charcoal into the grill and then cooking with a radiant heat in front of it.
Yeah, because it was a fairly consistent temperature. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that addressed your question of what they had. And like I said, if you put Gordon Ramsay or whoever there, they're going to make a pretty good meal out of it. And they had knives. They had a lot of help. One thing they didn't have up until the 14th century was a whisk. And I know about when they started having whisks because there was a French 14th century recipe that gives instructions on how to make a whisk out of a willow branch to whip eggs. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the recipe for making snow. You had snow? You've had snow. Snow is egg white and cream with rose water. No, not vanilla.
That's what we used.
Vanilla's New World though. And yeah, you mix in that and sugar and you whip it. And
Whip it good.
doing it by hand,
Freaking forever.
I've done it, it can't be done. But the neat thing about this is that the egg whites act as a stabilizer for the whipping cream. So you can sit this out longer. You know how if you sit a bowl of whipped cream and it gets that soup at the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
This stuff doesn't. It's a consistency of Cool Whip, and it smells of roses. And if it's like me, I put so much rose water in, you think you've just eaten a bar of French soap. But, oh man, I've had people chase me around the kitchen just to lick the bowl from this stuff. But yeah, and in there with the instructions on how to make a whisk. By taking a willow branch, split it this way, split it this way. Anything else? I hope that was vaguely entertaining for you people and worth your while.
Yeah, if there's nothing else, there was a joke in our story in the Reader's Digest years ago where a gardener in a big estate in England gets an award, and the owner of the property says, yeah, I'll send you to England, to London to pick up your award, but don't go nuts at the hotel. Well, he comes back and the bill comes and he gets called in. Look at this bill. He says, well, I live simple, pheasant, venison. just like here.
I can hear the story of Chicken Brittle if you want to hear it.
Huh?
Chicken Brittle?
Okay.
I came across this recipe for pineade, which, there's, I'm looking at this recipe and it talks about heating up honey to basically a hard cracked candy stage and adding in chicken. And I'm not sure what I was thinking. They had lots of spices, and I think I was thinking something like a sweet and sour chicken or spicy, like General Tso's. I'm not sure what. I decided to go ahead and make this, and unfortunately, I decided to actually make it for dinner. And it smelled great, all up into the point I put the chicken in, and it's just bad things happen with chicken and hard cracked candy honey. The chicken overcooks and sort of all the water comes out of it instantly, and it sort of gets hard and chewy and overcooked to the point of almost being burned. And the hard cracked candy, because of the added water, all of a sudden gets sort of soft and gooey, and you end up with this. It was awful. It it was quick, let's make some fish sticks for the kids, cause this stuff is inedible and will put you in a diabetic coma. And I'm trying to figure out what the heck happened, because most of the time I'm making these medieval recipes, and I get a good idea what it's gonna be like, and I make it, and it turns out at least reasonably edible, and this was awful. Well, it turned out, as I'm looking through the pineade recipes, because there's the recipes like it in a lot of other cookbooks, and I find, oh, there's like a dozen different variations on this recipe. This is the only one that called for chicken. And I'm looking at this, and I look more, and I realize I figured out what happened. Some scribe was copying a cookbook to a cookbook, because they did. They'd steal the recipes, and he started copying out one of these pineade recipes, which was just honey boiled to hard candy stage with spices and pine nuts, and basically it's pine nut brittle, and it's really quite tasty. And so he's copying out this pineade recipe and reading, and he's talking to Joe over his shoulder here, and his finger slips over here, and he starts copying another recipe for something with chicken, and he copies more and more. He realized what he had done before he finished the recipe, because the last line of his recipe was, and if you want the candy, leave out the chicken. If I'd looked at any of the other recipes, I would have known, but no.
There was a joke like that in one of in a Discworld cookbook, where there's supposed to be different recipes or different characters' recipes, and there's mint humbugs from the head of the Assassin's Guild, and every other line is basically, this would be a good time not to add the arsenic to it.
And don't do this. Anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
My mother's current